To give us more insight into Lucy by Damien Atkins, this is a Relativity series bonus episode from LA Theater Works and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, bridging science and the arts in the modern world. Here's our producing director, Susan Lowenberg.
Dr. Daniel Geschwind is a leading researcher in the field of genetics, especially as it pertains to autism. He holds the Gordon and Virginia MacDonald Distinguished Chair in Human Genetics and is director of the Neurogenetics Program and the Center for Autism Research and Treatment. I spoke with him in his office at the Department of Neurology and Psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine. I began by asking Dr. Geschwind how and when autism was first identified.
Autism wasn't recognized as a distinct condition until it was described by Kanner in the 1940s. And Leo Kanner, in his seminal publication, described 11 children, mostly boys, who had an autistic disorder. And if one goes back and looks at that, it's extremely accurate, vivid, and in-depth, and really does relate to a lot of what we see in autism today. So it's kind of surprising that in between that description that we go back to look at and now, there's been a lot of straying off the path of what this disorder really is. The key aspect is a dysfunction in normal social interaction and engagement. But it also includes problems in language and difficulties in an area that can be thought of as mental flexibility, so that the children might have repetitive behaviors or restrictive behaviors or a resistance to changes in their normal routine that would cause them to become quite disruptive, for example, if things are changed. And that's really the fundamental core three features of autism.
What about the inability to express emotion or reciprocate affection?
Emotion and affection and this reciprocation are not really core features of autism. Many autistic children are very affectionate. It's an issue of how they relate. And so they are quite emotional and have quite a range. Now, that doesn't mean that it's absolutely 100% normal, but it's not the absence of those things. It's just that they may be slightly abnormal. Many autistic children have difficulty perceiving emotions in others properly. We don't know whether the core problem with social behavior and social cognition and social, what we call social reciprocity or engagement, is due to a difficulty with emotional regulation or the ability to perceive emotions in the faces of others or in the gestures, or that that's just a part of it.
In the play, the author takes us into Lucy's interior world so that you hear her giving us her thoughts that are not expressed. You hear her in a perfectly normal voice talking about what she's thinking and feeling. Is there some thought that an appropriate reaction is going on in the brain, but the actual expression of it to the outside world is encumbered?
Social interaction, the sharing and giving of emotion and ideas, takes an integration of an enormous amount of the brain and its systems. You can have pieces of things, but it can look very abnormal on the outside because of the really delicate orchestration that has to go on within the brain. The one thing about autism is that it's very heterogeneous in what its causes are, its etiology, as well as what it clinically looks like. So that there are people with autism who have severe what's called dyspraxia, or difficulty actually speaking, a developmental dysphagia as part of the autism, and apraxia. And it's remarkable now people have gotten some of those folks to type, and it's clear they have all the thoughts and are very intelligent. There definitely is a subset of these children and adults who will have very quite complex and meaningful inner worlds that aren't being expressed to the outer world. We don't know the extent to which that might be universal across autism, but I suspect that it's much more frequent than we thought before.
In the early 1970s, the influential psychologist Bruno Bettelheim promoted what he called the refrigerator mother theory. which held that cold, unnurturing parents, especially mothers, were to blame for autism. How long did this view of the condition prevail, and how pervasive and influential was it?
Yeah, the refrigerator mother theory was quite unfortunate in one sense, in that it really moved autism out of being a biological or biomedical disorder into the realm of poor parenting, which totally influenced the direction of research. If you think that something is not biological, it's just due to poor parenting, then you don't look into its causes and etiology. Now we know that autism has an enormous genetic liability, that there are environmental things as well that can lead to autism. So we know that poor parenting is not the cause of autism. But one also has to put Bruno Bettelheim's work in perspective, in that although his theory, I think, was very destructive for the field and very tough for families as well, so had a lot of cost in a way, it was based on research that had actually gone on in the 40s and 50s with monkeys, where if you give monkeys not the right mothering, they ended up being socially awkward and looking somewhat autistic, and showing autistic-like behavior. So I think that extreme examples of extraordinary deprivation of normal parent-child bonding will cause all kinds of mental illness or contribute to them, but that those extremes are seldom seen in any society, no matter how bad. An example are the orphans in Romania, who have an increased prevalence of autism due to the fact that they basically had no proper parenting and were, let's say, mistreated. I don't know the literature there perfectly, but that's a really big outlier in terms of parenting, and that would not explain the vast majority of autism. But autism and brain development and brain disorders are always due to an interaction of genetic factors and things that happen in the environment. So extreme forms of deprivation in the right genetic context could certainly lead to severe abnormalities of behavior that might be considered along the autistic spectrum. One thing to say, though, about the issue of the parent-child interaction, it's clearly important in child development. But the point of the refrigerator mother was that it was causal. And it's very clear that in the vast, vast majority of cases, that the parents have nothing to do with the causality. But certainly that the interaction between parent and child will clearly help mold who the child is. And so if the child has a problem and the parent isn't equipped to deal with it, it's a bad situation all around, whatever the mental illness is.
But autism is genetic, and yet you don't have autistic parents of autistic children. How do you explain that?
Genetics works in many ways. If we think about autism like we would think about, let's just say, height, weight, often you have tall parents, you tend to have tall kids, but you don't always. Not all the children are tall. And the fact that if you have 5 or 6 children, the children may vary quite a bit. You may have thin parents and slightly heavy children, or vice versa. And so there is a correlation. And what this is called is complex genetics. It's not one gene where there's a relationship that gene causes autism or causes obesity in most cases. And that these common conditions like autism have to be thought of as quantitative traits, parts of a spectrum where we all have a lot of variation in our language abilities or social abilities. And we see that in the parents of autistic kids, there is, especially in families that have more than one child, a clustering of very sub-threshold symptoms. They wouldn't be called autism, but if you compared a group of them to a group of parents who had non-autistic children, they would be characterized as more aloof or more rigid. They may have a higher incidence of language delay as children. Those kinds of things are seen. So the idea is it's a kind of mixing of multiple genetic risk factors with the environment that ends up with the child. And that's not the case in every family. There clearly are different kinds of autisms, if I may use that word. But a common form of autism would be this kind of familial autism, where you see very subtle signs or hints in the parents of specific aspects that relate to the condition, like the rigidity I mentioned. But you would never call the parents autistic at all. In fact, they're not.
In the play, Vivian, the mother, reaches a point where she feels that Lucy's autism represents a possible next stage in our evolution. Is this purely fanciful, or are what we consider genetic abnormalities a glimpse at how our basic code is changing or even evolving?
I think that's a very provocative and brilliant kind of idea. Obviously, we can't know what evolution has in store for us. If autism is increasing, and we don't know that it is actually, but if it is, it's a very interesting idea that the way that society has been structured now, that people who are rigid and obsessive and might have slight language delay and who are socially withdrawn might excel. That would actually create evolutionary pressure in favor of that kind of adaptation. It's interesting when we think of the creative process, many people who are writers, and when I have to write scientific writing, I do the same thing. I can't sit down in between appointments with people and write something interesting. I need to withdraw from social interaction. In fact, people have writers' retreats where they go to a quiet place where they don't see people for months so that they can really be lost in their thoughts, etc. If we think about that as some of the pinnacle of our civilization, great art, great writing, great creation, the creative process, that really in some ways depends upon, for most of us, the ability to withdraw socially. So I wouldn't say that Lucy's mom is onto something, but I think it's something that we really have to consider.
I suppose one could speculate that the kinds of people who create these amazing new technologies, particularly where they concern communications, the internet and all of those attendant discoveries, there's something about that that sort of reminds me of some of the issues that Vivian brings up in the play, because as many people have pointed out, these technologies, as wonderful as they are in some peculiar way isolating as well.
We think of the internet and computers as those technologies, but how about the automobile? How about the airplane? I think that when we're going about on the street in Los Angeles, we do not do it bumping into other people and talking with them or running into them at the village square while we're getting our groceries. We pass people in our vehicles. And so our modern society has many ways of isolating us and separating us from actual human contact in ways that I think many of us haven't thought about a lot. Many of the technologies that we have allowed us to interact less in some ways, in a personal way. It's increased the space between us, whether it's virtual or real. But having a ton of steel between you and everybody else changes your relationship with them in the car. I've noticed that especially because I'm not a Los Angeles native, but now I've been living here for 18 years, and it's just striking how the difference between living in New York City or Boston, where you're walking and bumping into people on the street, literally bumping into them, touching them, as you're walking, is really, it's remarkable to get that close to anybody in a year in Los Angeles, even if you walk up and down streets. So it's, if that's the future of society, even forget the computers. It's a pretty interesting kind of isolation.
I want to go back to the whole issue of psychology versus biology. Are there still people today who dispute the biological interpretation?
Well, now that we know that the mind emanates from the brain, it's hard to separate psychology from biomedical, because a lot of what we think and feel comes from this organ called the brain. And so there are different ways to approach different levels and kinds of disorders. Some need a medication. Some need medication plus a kind of talk therapy, for lack of a better word. And others are much better off without any medication and with in-depth therapy because of things that have happened to people. Imagine if you have a bad experience or a series of bad experiences, even bad parenting, if you were abused or something. That kind of experience is going to need therapy. Again, it really depends upon the dimension on which the disorder really comes from, where it emanates, where its roots and etiology are. I think that very few people would now say that autism is not a biomedical disorder. I think the major debate is how much of it is genetics and how much of it is environment at this point.
How did your own work lead you into the research you do with genetics?
Well, fundamentally, I was interested in understanding what makes humans humans and how we develop our higher cognitive specializations, things like language and our real advanced social abilities. And these are very related to a number of human disorders. And so we work on, and as a physician, I work on human disorders that affect cognition, both in children and in adults, neurological disorders. But from a basic science standpoint, I was asking the question, how does our brain, the organ that underlies these behaviors, develop? Why is it different than chimpanzees or mice? And so that led to genetics, because genetics is an extremely powerful set of tools for unraveling those kinds of mysteries. We can actually compare the genomes of humans to these other animals to identify what the differences are and then go back to the brain and study them. And so from a genetic standpoint, I was studying the development and patterning of the brain, especially those regions involved in language. How can we function with these basic human elements gone? I mean, social behavior is at the core of what we do, and yet it's severely disrupted in this disorder. And so that became very interesting to me, as well as the connection between social behavior and language.
If you've identified between 10 and 20% of the genetic mutations that have been responsible, are you personally hopeful that you will be able one day to interfere with these genetic abnormalities and affect a cure?
I think it's too early to know exactly where the genetics and where the causes are going to lead us. One hope would be that we can identify biochemical pathways that are disturbed, at least in a fraction of children, that are amenable to treatment. We already know in mice that if we put certain mutations, some of which are related to autism, in these mice that cause a severe neurodevelopmental disorder in the mice and let their brains develop, that if we turn the gene on or off in the adult or give them a drug that would treat the pathway, that we can have a major effect on the adult with the disease. So it may not, in some cases, be even necessary to intervene at the developmental stage to change the brain development. We may be able to affect brain function in children or in adolescents or even adults. And that gives me a lot more hope, because the difficulty of intervening, let's say in utero, with gene therapy or something like that is really off the table right now in terms of a viable therapy. So the idea of being able to intervene later would be helpful. On the other hand, we know that if we look at 100 children with autism now, that we could take a third of the children who don't speak, let's say at age 2.5 or 3, and with the proper and most state-of-the-art cognitive and behavioral intervention, we could get those children speaking. And certainly we've seen that here in some of our programs. There's a very well-known but small program that takes early children, many of whom have no language when they come in, and in 10 or 12 weeks they can have hundreds of words. That kind of therapy takes money. It takes very specialized expertise. There aren't enough people trained to deliver it. And it's going to take research to know how to best implement that on a large scale. But there's enormous hope that if we took what we know now and actually could apply that in our educational and early development systems, that we'd have an enormous impact on children. And that's why it's critical, even though we don't have genetic interventions, to diagnose children with autism as early as possible while the brain is still plastic and while these behavioral and cognitive interventions actually can do the most good. If you fall behind in language early on, you get into school, you have difficulty reading or with language, that's going to affect how you do everything. You're going to end up not learning math. You're going to end up being unhappy. It may affect the way that you interact with other children in your class. And so you can see that the earlier we intervene, the better chance we give a child with autism or another neurodevelopmental disability to eventually be mainstreamed, or to have, even if they're not mainstreamed in school, to lead a successful and satisfying life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Geschwind. It was really just an interesting and fascinating and inspiring conversation.
Thank you. Really, it was my pleasure.
I've been speaking with Dr. Daniel Geschwind, who holds the Gordon and Virginia MacDonald Distinguished Chair in Human Genetics and is director of the Neurogenetics Program and the Center for Autism Research and Treatment at UCLA.